Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2022, a masterclass brought to you by the Foreign Policy Association. There are 9 topics in this masterclass. We are now at the point of looking at topic number 7, which is drug policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean. We have declared war on a number of entities over time. If we look back to the early 1940s, there was the declaration of war against Germany, Italy, and Japan, the Axis powers of World War II. There was a declaration of war on illicit drugs in the 1970s, and a declaration of war against global terror. Most recently, we've declared war on COVID. So what this tells us is that declarations of war are mere words. The question is what sort of policies underwrite them, give them life, and allow us to achieve our national interests. Before we can consider American foreign policy options, there are 3 main considerations. We're going to look at the bureaucratic landscape of dealing with international drug policy, the extent of the problem from Latin America, and then finally Latin America's own drug problem. We begin with the bureaucratic landscape. The United States, of course, is a very complicated government. The White House on top, the President presides. Drug Enforcement Agency plays a central role in our war on drugs and our policy towards illicit drugs in Latin America and the Caribbean. But it's not the only federal agency that deals with drugs. Far from it. The landscape is littered with dozens of federal, regional, and state-level agencies, all of them working together or against each other in confronting illicit drug trade, trafficking, and of course use. There are 43 federal agencies alone involved in American drug policy globally, which includes, of course, Latin America, and they're very often struggling with and against each other. They're doing so for primacy, for attention, and for resources, or they simply struggle with each other because they speak different bureaucratic languages and have different protocols. There are several different theories of bureaucratic behavior that we can apply to American foreign policy. There is what we call RAM, or Rational Actor Model, Organizational Politics Model, or the OP model, and then BP, which is Bureaucratic Politics Model. They explain foreign policy bureaucracies in stark terms. Let's begin with the Rational Actor Model. It is by far the simplest and most straightforward. It is the ideal model for foreign policy making. It imagines the U.S. government as a unitary actor, with a very clear head, which is the president, with information from all of the agencies flowing upward, being vetted and filtered, analyzed and polished, and ultimately making it to the president's desk. The assumption is that when the president and his or her team consider a foreign policy option, they have all of the best information at their disposal. Decisions flow downward in an authoritative fashion. When the president speaks, when the president decides, that is the policy that is implemented. And the country's overall interest, it is assumed in this model, prevail over all local, regional, and political interests. It's the perfect model of foreign policy, and if only foreign policy operated in this fashion. The organizational politics model has a very different system. It sees a number of organizations that are arrayed across the government, all of them involved in various foreign policy issues. For some issues, it's only a handful. For ones like drug policy, 3 or more dozen of them. They each have a head, Secretary of State, Director of Central Intelligence, the highest ranking members of the military, whether it's in the Pentagon or the Chiefs of Staff, all of them represented at the top. But these individual organizations have their own agendas, their own bureaucratic language, and their own interest. And it's their own parochial interest that oftentimes are pursued. We would like to think that the Defense Department and the State Department work together, as much as we'd like to think that the CIA and FBI work together. But oftentimes they hide information from each other, they're competing against each other, and they view each other as bureaucratic rivals. That's the organizational politics model. And finally, and somewhat similar, is the bureaucratic politics model. Here we look only at the leadership of each of those organizations and where they sit around the table when the president enters the room. So clearly the head of the table is for the president, in the president's absence, the vice president, and then everyone else is arrayed around the table, and where you sit determines where you stand. Meaning whatever label you have, SecDef, SecState, Director of CIA, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that determines your policy position. And if you have someone that moves from one institution in the government to another, it's amazing how quickly their policy issues change, their positions change, because where you sit around the table is where you stand on policy issues. And these elite policy makers, the heads of these large bureaucratic organizations, they trade horses with one another. They make trade-offs. They cut side deals. They're trying to create a winning coalition to gain the president's attention. It's called fighting for the president's ear. And if the president is listening to you, it's more likely that financial resources and responsibility will flow in your direction. That's the bureaucratic politics model. When we look at American agencies that deal with drug policy in Latin America, we cannot for a moment view this as the rational actor model. It is organizational and bureaucratic politics without any question. And that, of course, is not optimal. But it's not just about the United States. We're just one of many important players in the global battle against illicit drug trafficking and trade. In Latin America and the Caribbean, there are dozens of countries, each with their own bureaucratic battles. And somehow we have to overcome all of those battles, including ones with us, if we're going to coordinate policy across the entire region. What is the extent of the drug problem in the United States? The numbers don't tell us everything, but we do know that annually $150 billion of illegal drugs enter the United States. What does that mean in terms of cost for the U.S.? We'd have to calculate all of the medical treatments, the law enforcement efforts to crack down on drug dealers and drug consumers, the crime that is often related with addiction to drugs, and don't forget the lost productivity. When people become sick because of drugs, they can't go to work. When they die, we lose a lifetime of productivity. So the drug problem in the United States is enormous. Putting a price tag on it is virtually impossible. Here we can see the main global trafficking routes for illicit drugs. There are three sources. There is the so-called Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia. That includes Myanmar, one of our great decisions this year. There is that Golden Crescent, which basically begins in Afghanistan, and then it has its travel routes throughout Africa and Europe, and then finally today's great decisions challenge, Latin America. As we look at our hemisphere, the drugs are largely produced in South America. They find their way to Central America, into Mexico, Caribbean islands, and on to the United States. The moment we crack down on land routes, the sea routes open up. We crack down on the sea routes, that opens the door for land routes. Very difficult to prevent the drugs from flowing into the United States. And once they reach our boundaries, they have a national network of highways and byways that they can use to spread across our great nation and poison our population. Latin America's drug problem is relatively straightforward. There are only 3 countries that promote or cultivate coca. That is, of course, the base of cocaine. They are Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. But from them, the drugs flow throughout the region and, of course, northward to the major markets in North America. In fact, 90% of the cocaine produced in South America arrives on American shores. The other 10% makes its way to Africa, to Europe, and beyond. Let's now consider American foreign policy options as it relates to drug policy. Three main areas of focus. There's the source of the drugs, where they're cultivated, where they're grown, where they're produced. Once they have finished production, there are transit routes that take them out of region and towards the United States and large markets, and then finally the destination, which with cocaine in Latin America is overwhelmingly the United States. And it's the same for marijuana and other illicit drugs. Let's begin with the source. Well, we do have options at our disposal. We can fly planes over crops and poison them. We can spray all sorts of agents, chemicals on them that will make the leaves wilt and turn brown and ultimately die. We can do this on the ground directly with the assistance, of course, of local governments. And we can also go there and simply burn the fields to the ground. The problem is that these fields are so massive in size, and very oftentimes they're in areas that are very difficult to get to. Add to that the reality that if we're going to spray toxins over these areas, defoliants, as we used in Vietnam with Agent Orange, we're going to cause a lot of civilian damage, deformation, and death. There have been major moves to have locals replace their coca production with other profitable market items such as coffee or soy, rice, or cotton. This is something that can happen if we're willing to subsidize it. Basically do abroad what we do for our farmers here at home, give them a leg up economically so that they can make a profit by selling in a highly competitive market. We cannot ask locals in Bolivia and Peru, among others, to give up a highly profitable drug production growth for something that's less economically rewarding. That just invalidates economic rational thinking. So we'd have to help them along the way. But there's a major problem with subsidies. Not only do we not provide them significantly for foreign farmers, we do provide them for our own farmers. So we have poor countries in Latin America, very wealthy countries like the United States. We funnel enormous amounts of taxpayer dollars to our farmers. And when I say farmers, I don't mean mom and pop operations. I mean conglomerates with CEOs, lawyers, ad agencies in New York City and Houston and Los Angeles. They wear the $3,000 Italian suits. They probably wouldn't know one end of a shovel from another, but they're operating these massive farming industries. They have lobbyists that are very well paid on Wall Street and in Washington, D.C., and they're going to make sure that policies are going to be directed in the favor of their conglomerates, in the favor of their industries. So we pay farmers not to grow products. If they do grow them, we pay them not to sell them. And we pay them to store the products that they've grown that we're also paying them not to sell, both domestically and internationally. And what this does is it creates a very high profit margin for these conglomerate agricultural industries and allows them to sell their products both domestically and abroad very cheaply. In poor countries, where there isn't that enormous tax base to tap into, there aren't these sorts of subsidies. And what that means is that their farmers cannot compete. If we ask them to compete directly with us and our subsidies, they're going to migrate north. They're coming to the United States, or if they stay at home, they're going to turn to illegal drug production. They really don't have a lot of other options. So we're clamping down on migration, we're subsidizing our farmers, and we're somehow surprised that poor farmers in South America are growing coca and other illicit products. All right, if the source cannot be addressed, why don't we cut them off at the pass? prevent those drugs from reaching the final destination. So let's take a look at how this works. There is the coca field. Inside of it, you've got the production, accumulation, and then initial transit to the production labs. We've already spoken of how the original point of production is very hard to get to. How about the production labs? Those are as well armed as any labs you'll find in the world. Premium, grade A military force with the best weaponry that drug money can buy. It would be a war in those countries for the governments to go after the production labs. And of course, the way that it works is that if the military of, say, Mexico attacks a production lab for marijuana, those production labs, those criminal elements are not going to go to war with their own government and military. They're going to commit acts of terrorism and attack on innocent populations, knowing that the population will then pressure the government of Colombia, of Mexico, or one of the others to halt their war on drugs. So cutting them off there is also difficult. The weakest point in this delivery chain is with the transit of the runners. These are people that are delivering, they're sometimes called mules. They're delivering the drugs across international boundaries to hand off to a new set of runners. We can attack them pretty easily, and that's what we tend to focus upon. Low risk for us and local governments, and a very high rate of success. The problem is that these runners are 14-year-olds. They're people who are very easily replaced. They are literally a dime a dozen in most of these countries. So as long as there are young people without jobs or futures, there will always be people to replace the runner that we just arrested and incarcerated. That certainly is not going to answer the question. So why don't we go to the real problem, which is the destination point, the demand side of the economic curve. Those drugs are produced and shipped to the United States for a singular reason. We are the market for them. We demand the drugs, we consume the drugs, we pay very high prices for those drugs. We can solve this problem with focusing on the United States. And what that means is that drug policy isn't just domestic and it's not just international, it is both of them at the same time. Our domestic policy is affected by our foreign drug policy, and our foreign policy is affected by our domestic drug policy. We call this issue intermestic. It's international and domestic at the same time, and it's one of the reasons there are 43 federal agencies and literally hundreds and thousands of state-level agencies involved in the drug policy. If we could succeed in dealing with the destination, American demand for drugs, it would solve the transit route problem and the source problem. If there's not a profit to be made, these criminal organizations are not going to produce an illegal drug. If they do, it'll be for shipment to other places on the globe. So how do we curb demand? What do we do about America's seemingly insatiable appetite for illicit drugs? The spectrum is wide. We can go the hardline route of law and order, hiring more police, more border guards, more sea patrols, and building a lot more prisons. Or we can go to the other end of the spectrum, the soft line side, and legalize at least some drugs. Take the criminal element out of it, as proponents argue. Law and order, we've been trying that since the 1980s at a minimum. It was in the 1980s, Mr. Reagan said, we're going to go after drugs. Mrs. Reagan said, just say no. But the government decided to begin incarceration with mandatory sentencing for drug offenders. And just look at the population explosion among American prisoners. So we have the Nixon Declaration, we have the Reagan Sentencing Reform Act. Put those two together, and we don't have enough prisons to hold them all. There are very few countries in the world that incarcerate a higher percentage of their citizens than the United States. And we could continue this curve right out into 2022, and the numbers are up and away. Now the major trend is private prisons. So we have, again, corporations profit motive, high-paid lobbyists in Washington directing resources to build private prisons, who have an incentive to encourage the sort of domestic policies and laws and sentencing that will send more customers to them. And of course, by customer, I mean prisoners. So if law and order isn't working, how about legalization? There's a strong movement in this country, and many U.S. states now have legalized pot or marijuana. But this never works because you can't legalize cocaine. You can't legalize methamphetamines. You can't legalize so many of the very hard drugs, the dangerous killing drugs that are very popular in the United States. And even legalizing marijuana won't work. I mean, companies will make a profit and people will smoke, I guess you'd call it safe weed, but there's always going to be a demand for stronger marijuana, stronger beyond the envelope of what domestic law allows, and there will always be a demand for cheaper marijuana. Legalizing it raises the price. It must be regulated, inspected, taxed, and as a result of that, the price of marijuana goes up, and that means there's always a market for less expensive, i.e. illegal, marijuana being shipped in, including marijuana that is much, much stronger than what people can get through the legal resources. Legalization doesn't work, law and order doesn't seem to work, but there's a whole array of options in between, both domestic and international. From a foreign policy point of view, if the United States is going to succeed, short of ending American demand for drugs, which no one sees happening in the future, we have to get along better with the governments of Latin America and the Caribbean. We need to build trust with Mexico first, because when there is something that happens across that border and we want to send the FBI or other special agents over to investigate, we need the Mexicans to cooperate with us and to allow us access to those areas. And if we don't have good relations with them, and if we can't trust them, then we can't work with them. Mexico is the first point of focus, but it very quickly becomes all of Central America, the Caribbean, and South America. That is a very tall order, and one historically that we have not been terribly successful at. We have a poisoned relationship with Cuba, and many countries in Latin America refuse to work with us on important issues until we can get beyond the Cuban issue. Beyond that, there is the very chilly relationship we've historically had with Brazil, the largest and most influential country in the region. So rather than thinking of policy that includes all of Latin America and the Caribbean, we should focus on Mexico first, clean up our mess of a policy in Cuba, which serves no one's interest economically or politically, and then work very hard on a better relationship with Brazil. From there, we can branch out and perhaps have more success in heading off the illegal drugs that are entering this country. Solving the destination is first, but focusing on foreign policy and better relations certainly has to be part of the calculation. Thank you once again for attending this lecture as we move quickly towards the end of the 2022 series. Stay engaged and make great decisions.
Okay, I see that Professor Pardo-Herrera has joined us.
Yes. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Professor. That was just the tail end of our Foreign Policy Association video on the topic. It just explains the basics. I'm sure that you're already well versed in everything that they covered. So hope it's okay that you missed the beginning.
Yeah, no problem. Totally.
Welcome, Professor Mike Carpenter here. We're so very, very happy that you could join us today, and it's my great pleasure as moderator to introduce you to our group. I may say a few words. Professor Pardo-Herrera is a graduate of University College London and holds a PhD in public policy from George Mason University. He is an international development scholar focusing on political economy of development, corruption, political and criminal violence in Latin America. His research links different forms of organized crime and political violence to development outcomes in Latin America. For over 15 years, he's worked with national governments, civil society, academia, and international organizations, designing and implementing policies to address organized crime and corruption, national resource management, human rights issues, conflict and post-conflict reconstruction. Professor Pardo-Herrera currently teaches at George Washington University's Elliot School and is a member of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at George Mason University's Schar School. Professor, we're really honored that you've accepted our invitation, and we extend to you the very warmest of welcomes. The floor is yours, sir, for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mike. I am very, very pleased to be here this afternoon sharing this conversation with all of you. I'm also very thankful for the invitation. I truly enjoy discussing all of these topics. This is one of my passions. So I'm very, very, very happy to be here. I'm not very familiar with the format, but I will be happy to adapt to whatever format you guys have in mind.
Well, basically, if you would just like to make a few opening remarks concerning drug trade, drug policy, U.S. drug policy vis-a-vis Latin America. And I should say, just for a few minutes, whatever is on your mind, whatever thoughts or trenchant observations you might have based on your experience working on these issues. And then we'll open the floor to questions and answers. And some people will be speaking to you directly via Zoom, and others will be submitting their queries to Adrian, and she'll be reading them out for your response.
Okay.
And as Adrian just said, we watched a brief video provided by the Foreign Policy Association on the topic of drugs. It was presented by a professor from Florida Atlantic University, a political science professor, Jeffrey Morton. And he basically outlined our approach, the US's approach, very enforcement centered, very federal government centered, with 43 different agencies engaged in drug suppression, and numerous untold numbers throughout the states and our various localities. And he sketched very definitively the three ways along, mainly where the sources are in Latin America, then of course the transit to the United States, where 90% of the cocaine produced in Latin America ends up, and then the destination itself, the consumers here in our country. So it's very much a demand and a supply situation. And I don't think that he left us with any clear-cut definitive route out of the problem. That it seems, in his mind, I think a balance between enforcement and a balance between perhaps legalizing some of the lighter drugs and working particularly, he maintained, with Mexico, with Cuba, so that we can gain more credence with other Latin American countries, and particularly with Brazil, given its economic dominance on the continent. So he seems to be prescribing a new and a somewhat refurbished approach to our drug policy here. And that was the central outline of what he was talking about. And basically, you've read the article. I think Professor Serrano concluded on somewhat of an ambivalent note, but obviously stressing that we really have to do more about suppressing demand in the United States, perhaps through educational programs, health programs, things of treatment programs, and so forth. So personally, after reading the article, watching the video, and ancillary reading that I've done in preparation for this afternoon, I come away with this from this with a very bleak outlook. I mean, we've been trying certain things for God knows a century or more now with the drug regimen, enforcement regimen. We've spent untold billions of dollars, perhaps trillions, and what do we have to show for it? So if that spurs some thoughts, we're at your pleasure to respond.
Yeah, totally. Great. Thank you, Mike. So yeah, so I think Professor Serrano's article basically outlines the, I would say, wide consensus, at least in the academic community, in terms of the failure of the counter-drug policy in the US, right? We've been fighting the so-called war on drugs for over 50 years now. The idea, when you want to assess a policy, you essentially have to go and look what you were looking to get out of a policy, and then you contrast that with the results, right? After 60 years, as Mike rightly mentioned, we have really nothing to show in terms of the objectives. The objectives 60 years ago were to reduce consumption and to reduce health risk associated to drug use, right? Both of those have failed, but along with that, I would say that we now have, and after 60 years, it's kind of what you would expect, we have a whole myriad of unexpected, and I would say unexpected results back then. So unforeseen results 60 years ago, but very foreseeable now in terms of side effects of the policy, in terms of violence, and not only street violence in all of the countries concerned, but also criminal violence all along the route of drug trade, right? And I'm not only speaking about cocaine here, I'm also speaking about heroin, and I'm also speaking now about fentanyl, right? Which is the new threat, if you like to use that word. So, and then when you think about this, the approach back then, and then keep in mind that we're thinking about a policy that was designed 60 years ago, right? The world was different. Governments were different. This was during the Cold War. Now we're way beyond that. The world is a lot, very, very different from the world that we had when we designed that policy, when we decided to go through law enforcement and prohibition, right? We created this massive system, global system, based in the UN to enforce the prohibition on some substances. And we went all over the world, making governments agree with that system. So we now have a very stable, I would say, very I would say it's a system that would make a lot of people jealous, right? A lot of people having a global system to enforce an agreed legislation in whatever topic is something that most transnational issues lack, but drugs have. We have a system. We have a United Nations agency only and specifically working to enforce those rules and to monitor the execution of that policy. That office reports every year, and then year by year we only see how the objectives that we set out to achieve 60 years ago are further and further away. And then I would also say that after 60 years, it's clear that every time that you ban something, whatever it is, if it's a drug, if it's a mineral, if it's some sort of information, whatever it is, if you decide to ban that item, but there's demand for whatever you're banning, you will be creating a black market, right? Whatever it is, it could be marijuana, cocaine, but it could also be, if we decided to ban milk tomorrow, the day after, we would have criminal organizations working to provide milk to those who demand it, right? And then we will create criminal organizations and a whole entire criminal illicit economy trading milk because we decided to ban it, and because there's demand, right? And that happens with any type of commodity, right? It doesn't matter. Really, we banned. You can think of commodities that we used to have, and then all of a sudden we banned. So drugs are a good example of that. For example, ecstasies, MDMA. Those were all legal in the 60s, 70s, and up to the mid 80s. But then we decided to ban those. We created a black market for those substances. We created a black market that enriches criminal organizations and that produces violence, right? Black markets are inherently violent. So whenever you ban something and you create that black market because there's still demand for that, you will also be generating violence. Essentially, because black markets lack the possibility to access courts to enforce contracts, right? When we enter into agreements, into commercial agreements in the illicit economy, and we sign a contract or we come to an agreement of whatever sort, and then one of the parties does not comply with what was agreed, we can always go to the courts, right, and start a legal procedure for the court to enforce our rights. Criminals in the black markets do not have that possibility. There are no courts in the black markets, in the criminal economy. So if you want to enforce a contract in the illegal economy, in the absence of courts, you resort to violence, right? That's why all criminal groups have basically armies behind them supporting their criminal activities. At the same time, criminal markets are also inherently corruptive, in the sense that every time that you need to go through the state or through a state representative, you need to resort to corruption in order to go through. When I say go through, I mean if you think of a legal market and you want to sell a specific whatever commodity it is, you will most likely need a permit, right? If you want to sell fruit in the district, if you want to sell fruit in Maryland and you want to open up a fruit shop, you're going to need to have a permit to sell those fruit, right? And you need to have a health certificate, and you need to have all of these different requirements, all of which make you go through a state representative. Because criminals in black markets can't do that. They will have to go through the state. But they will still have to go through the state, but they have to resort to corruption. So if you need to ship something that is illegal, because you cannot get a permit to ship that, you will need to bribe that official, or you will need to make some sort of illegal activity in order to be able to ship that commodity. So that to say that every time you ban an item, every time you ban a commodity, but there's demand for it, you will be generating a black market, which is inherently corruptive and which is inherently violent, right? That's the case. That's the case of illegal drugs. And no matter what it is, if it's cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, opioids, whatever it is, you are creating a criminal economy, which is violent, which is corrupt. And then, so those are kind of what we could now call the unanticipated effects of a policy we just signed 60 years ago, right? But like I said, now we know, we're very much aware, because we've done that many, many, many times with many, many, many commodities. So we're absolutely sure that every time that we ban something, we're going to create a black economy, and that black economy will produce violence and will produce corruption, right? Now, if we go back to the original objectives of the prohibition of drugs, like I said, those were to reduce consumption and reduce health risks associated to consumption, right? I have a couple of graphs that I think will be helpful to share, if I may.
Yeah, let me make you a co-host. Hang on one second.
Great. So like I said, every year the UN produces a report. So we have very good data on the results of that, of how the policy is going. And here we have figures from 2006 to 2019 in terms of prevalence of drug use and drug disorders, and global number of people who use drugs and people with drug use disorders. And I think this graph is, these couple of graphs are interesting because if you look at, if you contrast this, these are the last 13 years, we're drastically failing in both objectives, right? We haven't been able to reduce the number of people using drugs. If anything, that number has been stable. The graph on your right increases, but because global population also increases. But when you look at the one at the left, you'll see that the prevalence of drug use, which is the percentage of people using drugs, is, if anything, stable in the last 10 years, right? It's not going down. And then when you look at the health risks, then you see that too, in that regard, we're also failing, right? Because we have the same stable percentage of people having experiencing drug use disorders, right? That's the one on the left. Now, I think this shows also an interesting fact, which is that most people, about 90% of people who use drugs do not experience drug use disorders. So what this is saying basically is that 90% of the users are social users, or what we call the technical term escapes me, but this is people using drugs without experiencing any sort of drug use disorder, right? So most people are using drugs for fun and are getting away with it, right? This is all, we didn't know this 60 years ago, right? We thought everyone would experience a drug use disorder, right? Now we have, like I say, very good data, very stable data, and then we can see that most people use drugs for fun. Recreational users, that's the term, who have no issue with their drug use. Now, and so that's global in terms of drug use and altogether general drug use, but you can look at by substance, and you can see that most of the people using these drugs, so most of the people from the first two graphs, are concentrated in a few regions around the world, mainly North America, and depending on the substance, the Middle East and Southwest Asia, and some other substances like cocaine, also Australia and New Zealand. Amphetamines are also big in Australia and New Zealand, but an important hub of consumption is the US, of whatever drug you look at. So this is opioids on the left, opiates on the right. The difference between opioids and opiates is this. So opiates are from the plant, from the poppy flower, whereas opioids are synthetic drugs, right? And we have legal uses in both. The problem in the US is with the opioids, which are synthetic. Cannabis, if you look at cannabis, that's also a true fact. North America is one of the main users, Australia, New Zealand as well, and Europe, right? So when you see that most, we have the same amount of users, or at least the same percentage of users year after year, and then most users are located in 3, maybe 4 regions around the world, you see where one of the key issues is located, at least geographically, right? Now, when you look at the second large objective original objective of the policy, which was to reduce health risk, well, obviously deaths, we see that most deaths are caused by activities parallel to the use of the drugs. So people are not dying, or the majority of people are not dying from drug overuse, which was the thought 60 years ago, and is still the thought in many places around the world, right? If you die from drugs, you die because you overdid the amount of drugs that you were supposed to do. But again, if you look at the data, you see that most deaths are caused either by HIV, AIDS, or hepatitis C, which basically means that people are really dying from sharing syringes, sharing needles, right? That tiny light blue in the bar over here, this is drug use disorders. And this tiny purple one here is cocaine use drug disorder. So these are the overdoses here. Amphetamine use disorders, very tiny percentage here. Opioid use disorders over here, right? Again, this is interesting because we see that the prohibition is having unintended effects in the sense that people will resort to sharing needles because the substance is illegal. If we were to provide syringes, for example, and needles, enough of them so that people wouldn't have to share them, we would be saving this many deaths, right? Again, something we didn't know before, something that is very clear now. So that, looking at the demand side of the supply chain, right? And now let's look at the supply side, right? So most of the cocaine in the world is produced in Colombia, about 95%. Most of the heroin in the world is produced in Afghanistan, about 95% as well, right? The policies we've been implementing in Colombia have been mainly focused on aerial spraying historically of coca cultivation. Coca is the plant from where cocaine is produced. And this graph shows the amount of coca cultivation, which has become in political circles, in policy circles, so a sort of obsession. So we are heavily interested in the number of hectares that have been eradicated, but we're not really looking at this that much, right? In policy circles, the State Department produces a report every summer, and the UN produces an alternative report, a parallel report every summer as well, showing how much hectares we have eradicated. But no one is looking, and then the policy world celebrates when hectares go down, and then we get mad when hectares go up. But no one is really interested, at least publicly, again in policy circles and looking at deaths or consumption, which were the original objectives, right? We could look at the same, this is poppy cultivation in Afghanistan, same thing. The big discrepancy between Colombia and Afghanistan is that we never used aerial spraying in Afghanistan. We were mainly focusing on manual eradication of poppy flowers. But again, same thing. We produced several reports every year. This is what most people focus their attention on. But if you ask me, the production, and we could look at production statistics. Production statistics remain the same, regardless of the number of hectares. Essentially, because enough technology has been introduced into the cultivation of illegal crops in 60 years. So that now we have such efficient crops that can produce more in less space, right? So we used to have a certain type of seeds 20 or 30 years ago, which produced, if you needed a kilo of cocaine, you would need a hectare of land, a hectare of coca cultivation. Now you can have the same kilo and maybe a tenth of a hectare, right? Because of the technology that's been introduced into the seeds and to the cultivation processes. We also seize, in terms of how to stop all of this, we try to seize the illegal shipment of drugs. And in terms of cocaine, in the last years, we've decided to put more attention into the seizures instead of the cultivation part. So that shows what we're seeing here, the purple bars. We've seen a drastic, considerable increase in the number of seizures of cocaine, and then we have the rest of the bars are by different substances. And then going back to the demand side, what we have been doing here in the US, which is, as we said, one of the hubs of consumption, is sending people to jail, right? A lot of people to jail, right? We all know that the US has the largest prison population in the world. When you look at that in terms of the type of crime, drug offenses are a key reason why people are sent to jail. And then when you look at in detail how that population that is in prison because of drug offenses is distributed, for example, in terms of races, well, Black and Hispanic populations are a lot more have a lot more propensity of being sent to jail for drug offenses than people of the white race. So this is all to say that, like Dr. Serrano said in her article, I think no matter how you look at it, we are failing drastically in the achievement of the objectives we established 60 years ago when we started implementing this policy. I think I'm going to leave it there.
Professor, you have made that abundantly clear. You throw me into an even deeper funk than I was in before after your presentation. But one harkens back when we talk about trying to control these banned substances. Of course, the immediate thought that arises in the minds of Americans is our experiment with Prohibition in the 1920s and early 1930s, which ended up being a total disaster and indeed spurred exactly the sort of black markets and rampant criminality that you outlined. And I taking on board what you've just spoken to us about, it seems to me we're long overdue for some very, very much out of the box thinking on how to approach this problem, because what we're doing just it's not returning any kind of positive results. I mean, really significant positive results if you constantly have the same ongoing problem and you just keep doing whack-a-mole trying to control it and not really getting anywhere. Am I way off base here? Or?
I don't think so. I think that's like I said at the beginning, at least in the academic circles, that is, I think, a wide consensus. Now, when you move to policy, that's a different story, which is really the ones making the decisions. Why? We have not. This is evident, right? I think so. Statistics speak for themselves. So I guess the following question would be, why have we not made the adjustments that seem so obvious when you look at the issue in detail? And I think it has to do with well, there have been many explanations to that, but one is that policies, especially policies that have been in place for such long time, tend to become customs, tend to become culture. In technical literature, that is called path dependency. So once you start a path and you have defined that path, it is very hard to move away from that path, right? An example that is usually given is that, I don't know if you guys know, but the keyboard we use here in our computers is not the easiest of keyboards, right? Before, when we were designing 40, 50 years ago, when we were designing the best ways, the best way to type and to type fast, we found that there are other forms of keyboards that are much, much easier and much, much more efficient to use. But this one, which came from the typewriters, was already established, was already institutionalized, right? Nobody wanted to change. And that's one of the examples that is usually used to explain path dependency when it comes to policy. You get trapped into a decision path, and it's difficult to redirect. Now, there's also politics involved, right? There's also there's also ethics involved. We still think of policy in terms of trying to share some sort of personal ethics. And I think there's a lot of ethics still involved in the drug debate, right? That's how it started. When you read documents by which this policy was enacted, you read a lot of ethics. It becomes clear that ethics was a big element under consideration when this specific policy was decided, right? And I think ethics still plays an important role in the drug debate.
It probably does. Ethics or morals, and I think that was probably part of the foundation of Prohibition as well. But again, I just...
There is another question from Larry. Does legal oxycodone use change the destination and the illegal demand side of the story? If so, in what ways?
I'm sorry, can you read that again?
Oh, I'm sorry. From Larry, does legal oxycodone use change the destination or illegal demand side of the story? If so, in what ways?
Yeah, legal. If it's legal, so it's regulated. So when that's what we decide. We, the peoples of the world, through our congresses, decide what is legal and what is not. Right? Oxycontin is legal, and it's regulated. It's supposed to be. There are some requirements in order for you to access Oxycontin. That is what we do all the time. There is a black market for Oxycontin as well, and that is what caused one of the causes of the opioid epidemic. And in that case, the regulatory system failed. But yes, and that would be another debate, because you do need, like in any market, strong institutions, right? For example, and that is a great example. That is the key example of how regulating a substance can go bad, right? And we lived through it here in the US. It went really bad, but the institutions regulating the trade of OxyContin failed, right? But we didn't, and I agree, and then we can have that debate. But we had no cartels in the sense that we have when we think of heroin, when we think of cocaine. We did not have the criminal violence that we have when we think of cocaine, when we think of fentanyl, when we think of methamphetamines. So because it was in the legal world, we saved that violent essence of the black market, and we also saved that corrupt essence of the black markets, right? We did have the health issue, and that is I would say the best argument against regulating. But we regulate many things all the time, and we haven't done so bad in other ways, right? I mean, and then think of this. This is another thing. This is another way to think it. Like, we regulate tobacco. We regulate alcohol. We regulate sugar, which are very dangerous substances. Tobacco causes more deaths than illegal drugs. Alcohol, through cirrhosis, causes more deaths than illegal drugs. Sugar, through diabetes, causes more deaths than illegal drugs every year. Now, we regulate all of those substances. Regulated substances that kill a lot more people, right? So we can have that debate, and I think when we have that debate, politics and private interests get into the debate, right? Think about the discussion about labeling soft drinks with the amount of sugar that they contain, and what that has meant to Congresses around the world, right? A lot of money is introduced into through lobbying, so that people around the world don't know how much sugar is in soft drinks, because we know sugar is a dangerous substance, right? But we live with that, right?
Any other question there, Adrienne?
Yeah, we have one from Mary. Should and can schools be doing much more to require education about drug use? Why isn't this an essential and critical part of health education and policy?
I think, yes, totally. I think we can educate our kids. We should educate our kids better into drug use and drug abuse. Everything. We should educate them in terms of sugar. We should educate them in terms of tobacco. We should educate them in terms of alcohol, right? Marijuana, cocaine, everything, because all of those are dangerous substances. Education is a key, I would say education is a key element in curbing the demand. But if you think about how many people are using drugs for fun and having no problem with drugs, you would see that there are other factors that determine the likelihood of someone having a drug problem. Education will help, but social context is is determinant in the chances of someone going through drug use disorder or experiencing drug use disorder. So by that, I mean, it is one thing to experience with the drugs in a wealthy context, well-educated context, safe context, non-violent, and it is very different to experience with the drugs in a poor, underdeveloped, violent context. Chances are, if we have the same individual, chances are the individual in the wealthy environment will have fun and will go through the phase and will use drugs and recreate himself. Chances are the other person will not. Right. So education is one factor, but there are many other factors. Right. Another issue to discuss is whether or not we want to decrease recreational use. Like, yeah, I don't know. And that we saw it's not 90% of all use is recreational. Is that really a problem? I don't think so. From a health perspective, is not a problem. From a criminal perspective, is not a problem. And it happens every year all around the world. We saw, like, yes, more in some areas, more in some regions around the world, but all over. So I don't think that's I think we should just focusing on that small percentage of people having or experiencing drug use disorder, which is more or less what, if you extrapolate to the example of the Oxycontin, it's kind of the same. A lot of people use Oxycontin, are using Oxycontin right now, right? And they're not having any issues.
Mm-hmm. Your statement seems to fall in line. There was a book I was looking at, Transforming the War on Drugs. It was one of the recommended readings by Robert Muga and Catherine Akire. And they say that it's a quixotic quest to try to suppress drug use, and instead we should be quantifying the metrics for the decriminalizing and drug use and curbing drug use through public health measures. And that would seem to be what you're advocating as well, that we take our eyes off of the 90% that are causing no one other than perhaps themselves some harm, and concentrate on that 10% if we can identify them and zero in on them to get them off the habit.
Yeah, if we look back at the original objectives of the policy, yes, I think we should go for that 10%.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now, another issue I forgot to mention, like those who die, most of them, or an important percentage of them, don't die because they ingested too much. They didn't know they were ingesting too much, right? And that's what happens in black markets. You don't know what you're ingesting, right? Hmm. You have, in the legal market, you know that pill that you bought from the pharmacy has 90 milligrams of whatever substance you're trying to ingest, right? In the black market, you don't know that, right? Most deaths happen because you don't know the concentration of whatever you are using. So that's what causes the overdose in an important percentage of the cases, right? It's not only addiction.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions there, Adrian?
Oh, yeah, we've got questions streaming in from Larry. Does the increase of the number of guns in the U.S. from about 50 million in 1970 to 400 million today exacerbate the illegal demand side of the story in the U.S.?
That is a great question. Guns do not increase or exacerbate the illegal demand, but what guns, and specifically American guns, fuel is criminal violence in Mexico and the rest of Central America. So when you look at illicit trade in the Western Hemisphere, so the Americas, You see drugs, so cocaine specifically, cocaine and people flowing north, and guns and money flowing south. Money laundered, the money gets laundered here, and it's enjoyed by those who export the drug. But guns, since it's so easy to have access to guns in the US, most of the criminal violence attached to the illegal trade in drugs is executed with American guns. Yes, that is a big transnational security issue. And it's interesting, right? When I said that the world is different from what it was 60 years ago, 60 years ago, we could think about states and countries as individual entities, right? One here, one there, like being related one to another, but not to the point where we are right now, right? We can, I think a better way to understand or to think of the world today is like a big city and countries as neighborhoods, because globalization has made us very close to one another, right? We can now not only travel, but we can send money, buy things, we can communicate with people anywhere around the world very, very, very easily, right? So what happens in one neighborhood will necessarily have an impact in the neighborhood next to it. So the production of drugs in Mexico and Colombia will necessarily have an impact on the neighborhood, right? And the lax legislation on guns in the US will necessarily have an impact on the rest of the neighborhood. Yes.
And it's not Mr. Rogers' neighborhood either. You have another.
Okay, the next one is, so you're saying the solution is to legalize and regulate? This would eventually eliminate the violence, et cetera, involved with the illegal market. Big Pharma would produce and distribute the legal cocaine, et cetera.
I think that is what happened. That is a great question, Ruth. I think if we ever get there, it's not going to be Colombian enterprises producing the cocaine. It's going to be Pfizer. It's going to be Abbott. It's going to be Bayer. That is what would happen.
The lecture that we heard earlier, the Professor Morton seemed to allude to that, but he also said that if we produce the drugs legally in the United States, they would end up costing more than those that are smuggled in, and that might skew the market a different way.
It depends on the drug, because so you can't grow coca in the States. Coca comes from the tropical climate, so you can't grow coca. But yes, for synthetic drugs, which could be produced here.
And maybe a synthetic drug that would be the equivalent of coca.
Like I said, we would have to have an individual discussion for each substance. Mm-hmm. And that, I don't think that's anything out of the question. It's what we do. That's the pharmaceutical sector does that. We regulate each substance, right? Some substances we say, no, this one is too dangerous, right? And another thing is that the illegal drug market, several hundred new substances enter the illegal drug market every year. That's how much people like to use drugs. So a couple of hundred new substances every year. Not all of them are successful. It's like any other market, right? You put out your product there, you hope for it to sell. Most don't sell. So after 1 or 2 years, those new substances just leave the market because nobody bought them, right? Just like any other type of market. Cocaine is a big hit, right? Everyone likes cocaine all around the world. Now that's if we compare it, cocaine was the king of drugs or the queen of drugs 40 years ago, not so much currently. We now have other substances competing against cocaine seriously. And synthetic drugs have entered the market and have now gained an important percentage of that market. But since Ruth asked about the question about cocaine, I think, yes, cocaine, if you legalize it, you will have several pharmaceutical companies moving their plants down to Peru, Bolivia, Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil, growing coca and producing cocaine, and yes, and paying taxes like any tobacco company does right now.
One big happy neighborhood. Okay, Adrian, any other questions?
Yeah, from Larry, to build a bit on what Bill said, if you're asked to propose a solution to US policymakers, what would you suggest?
I think regulating, you need to regulate each drug specifically, individually, right? It's like, for example, heroin is very different than cocaine, right? The addiction rate to heroin is different than the addiction rate for cocaine. It's different from the addiction rate of marijuana. Right? Think of the technological evolution of marijuana. Marijuana used to be a plant, right? But now we have a wide variety of marijuana, and a large percentage of which is not natural, right? So it's not like when you say we're going to legalize drugs and then period. No, it's a very complex procedure, but it's what we do with all substances. So yes, I think regulating each substance individually will be much better than what we have.
Combine an education program as to the ill effects of drug abuse.
Right. Think of how. So I have small children. I guess you guys have older children. Think of how you educated your kid in terms of alcohol use or tobacco use. It'll be the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. You need to speak to your child about alcohol, right? It's easier to get it's easier to get illegal drugs than to get alcohol, right? Mm-hmm. But you went through that and your kids went through that and my kids will go through that. It's not, it sounds like very different, like, woo, because we've lived under the idea that these drugs are something extraordinary, but these are just other substances, like many substances with which we live currently. So I have to teach my children about illegal drugs. They will. Whether or not they're legal or regulated, they will have access to illegal drugs, as your kids did. Mm-hmm. And most likely as your grandkids and my grandkids will, right? Because people use substances and have used substances since time being. Alcohol used to be a bad thing, right? There was morals involved in the use of alcohol. But now alcohol is just a cultural thing. Like we use it every weekend in small amounts, like you need to be a certain age,
No, you make a very good point.
And then you learn how to use it.
Adrian, any other question there?
Yeah, we've got one from Mary. How do you define drug use disorders? Is addiction a drug use disorder?
Yes. So basically, that's what drug use disorder means. When you have a problem using the drug, which is what you try to prevent when you regulate, right? Because we know OxyContin is extremely addictive, right? And if institutions had not failed, a lot of people would be alive today. But again, a lot of people use Oxycontin, are using Oxycontin today, according to the rules, and they're safe, right? What we would achieve through regulation is less negative health effects, which was the original goal 60 years ago.
Good point. Adrian?
Yeah, we've got this one. In 2 days' time, either 62-year-old Gustavo Petro or 77-year-old Rodolfo Hernandez will be elected the new president of Colombia. Petro, a former guerrilla, hoping to become his country's first leftist president, is pledging to address climate change and inequality. Hernandez, who says he is a follower of a great German thinker, Adolf Hitler, is running on an anti-corruption platform. Have you any idea how they'll deal with drugs if elected?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So Colombia produces 95%, 94, 93, 95% of the world's cocaine, right? And it was interesting because during this presidential debate, everyone who works on these issues obviously pays attention to what goes on in Afghanistan because, again, heroin comes from Afghanistan. Most of the heroin comes from Afghanistan. Everyone pays attention to what goes on in China because most of the fentanyl comes from China. Everyone pays attention to what goes on in Mexico because most of the methamphetamines come from Mexico. So everyone pays attention to what goes on in Colombia. And what was very interesting in this presidential campaign was that every candidate, every but one, who was not running on Sunday. Every candidate said that the current anti-drug policy needed to be adjusted. Now, no one can promise regulation because it's not a matter of Colombia. Illegal drug trade is a transnational issue. We have, like I said at the beginning, we have a system dealing with the transnational shipment of illegal drugs. So it's not a decision that can be made by Colombia. So I'm not sure what they mean when they said that they were going to adjust the policy against drugs. But what was interesting was that everyone agreed that we needed some change. And that was interesting to hear.
Mm-hmm. Adrian, any other questions?
Yeah, for more than 4 days in May, Colombia's largest drug cartel, Clan de Golfo, terrorized more than 100 municipalities in retaliation for the extradition to the U.S. of its leader, Dairo Antonio Usuga. In the same month, Paraguayan prosecutor Marcelo Pecci was assassinated while honeymooning in Cartagena. Authorities said Pesci's murder showed the increasingly international nature of crime in the region. Are Colombia or other nations losing ground in combating drug trafficking, or did they never really hold any in the first place?
I'm sorry, the question was what? No, so the question, the last
sentence. Are Colombia and other nations losing ground in combating drug trafficking, or do they never really hold any in the first place?
So again, illegal drugs is a transnational issue. It's not Colombia or Afghanistan or the US or Mexico. It's everyone, right? We saw that certain countries in the world produce what certain countries around the world consume, right? Now, like I said, if there is demand for something, there will be supply for that thing, always, right? We don't sell typewriters anymore just because people don't buy typewriters anymore. We found a substitute for typewriters. We found computers, right? People don't use film photography anymore because we found a substitute for that, right? People don't go to Blockbuster anymore because we found a more efficient substitute for Blockbuster, right? We haven't found a substitute for cocaine. Cocaine's still highly demanded around the world. Now, because it's illegal, it's an illegal market, it will be violent, right? And because it produces so much money, that violence will keep increasing. Some people, especially in the US, thought that the peace agreement with FARC should have meant the end of cocaine production, because FARC was heavily involved in the drug trade, right? Which, if you ask me, was a very naive thought, because the consumers are all the same all over, right? And if the consumers remain, the production and the supply will continue. It will just switch hands, and that's what happened. And that's what's been happening since cocaine became so popular in the 80s, right? It was when it was Pablo Escobar, then it was the Cali cartel, and then it was the paramilitary, and then it was FARC, and now it's the Clan del Golfo. If you think that criminal violence is going to stop someday, I think you're far from reality. That violence will never stop. That violence will never stop.
Well, on that positive note, any other questions, Adrian?
Yeah, we have one from Larry. Sound medical procedures related to pregnancy are now hyper-politicized. Think abortion. Do you think the same is the case for drug policy? It seems bleak to me, to echo Mike Carpenter.
Sorry, again, I lost you for a second.
Sorry. Okay. Sound medical procedures related to pregnancy are now hyper-politicized. Think abortion. Do you think the same is the case for drug policy? It seems bleak to me, to echo Mike Carpenter.
It depends. It depends on the country, it depends on the state even. I guess so, I guess it depends on age range. Yeah, I think it's a good parallel. I don't know. It's highly sensitive, especially in some age groups, especially in some geographical locations, not only in the US, but around the world, especially among certain ideologies. Yeah. This is the thing we've been carrying with, I think the drug debate has been carrying with morals for way too long. And there's nothing good or bad about using substances. We use substances every day. So we drink coffee every day. We drink tea. We ingest sugar. It's just that some substances have been carrying this morality around them that makes it very difficult to evolve in the debate. I will agree on that. Yeah.
Very good point. Adrian, any other questions?
More people died in liberal San Francisco last year from fentanyl overdoses than COVID-19. Yet not a single person in 2021 was convicted for dealing fentanyl. The district attorney there just lost a recall vote, a repudiation of his soft on crime decarceration approach. Is this a one-off, or might it portend a longer-term setback toward alternative methods for addressing the drug trade?
So think of so on unregulated substances, what you're using, you don't know exactly what you're using. So when you're looking for some sort of effect, you might get the effect that you're looking for with a certain amount, but because you don't know concentration, the same amount may kill you the next time. So all of those deaths from fentanyl could be explained from that. You don't know exactly what you're using. You don't know exactly what you're ingesting. Now, if we would stop thinking about this as a black market, right, and we regulate it, and you put it, say we draw a line here, which is prohibition, and we take it, we take it from this side and we put it here, where it's legal but regulated. So violence, you don't need violence anymore. So Pfizer does not send a hitman to enforce contracts. Pfizer does not need an army to safeguard their facilities, right? Pfizer just has an army, but of lawyers in case they want to enforce a contract. We would, if you bring the trade from here and you put it here and you regulate it, you will reduce violence and you will reduce, for example, those deaths that were recorded in the West Coast.
Adrian, I think we're running over our normally allotted time here. Perhaps we have time for one more question if there's one out there, and then we'll let the good professor go. We've really put him through his paces this afternoon.
Sure.
I'm really very happy to be here, and I'm really very enjoying myself. Truly.
Well, I think that's about all that we've got from the audience. Yeah.
Okay, good enough. Well, if that's the case, Professor, we're much indebted to you, and we want to thank you very, very much for coming along on, I know it was short notice, our invitation to you, and then you had this other difficulty and had to come an hour late, and yet you persevered and you're here and you really enlightened us on this topic. And we're glad to have your thoughts, your thinking, your prescriptions for how we might better address this longstanding problem going forward. It's really been very enlightening, and we're in your debt. Thank you, sir.
No, not at all. It was truly a pleasure. Thank you for your time. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. Truly.
All right. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Okay. And thanks all of you for joining us. So that's it until September 17th, when we'll meet again to begin our autumn agenda. The topics we'll be discussing are three. U.S. international industrial policy, changing demographics, and President Biden's foreign policy. So we look forward to seeing you then and wishing everybody an enjoyable and safe summer.
Thank you, Adrian.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
See you all.